again, everybody. It is I, Nick Pennsylvania, with my friend, as always, Brendan Bond. Good evening, Brendan.
Good evening, Nick.
And we have a lot of apologies. We realize we have not been around for a while, and we are very sorry about that. But just kind of, I think we said this the last time we were on, kind of giving a heads up. Over the past couple months, we have been playing some festivals. This is usually the end of our busy season as a band. We had also found a weekend in which we squoze in an entire album recording, which Bond is mixing and all of that fun stuff. You wrapped up doing audio for a theater thing. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, there was a theater group that I was helping with and got to do a little audio work for them, which was really exciting because it was a new muscle that I got to work on from a audio engineering standpoint. So hopefully going to be doing more of that in the future.
Yeah, and I would like to come and see some of that. Well, the last week has been very chaotic for all of us because we have a fairly small and close group, and sadly we kind of in a very dramatic fashion lost a friend of ours this week, and that's all I'm going to say about this right now, because it's a public thing and we don't need to get into that, but it has definitely been very upsetting, and a lot of people in our world and in our community are kind of circling the wagons, as it were, at the moment. So it's just been a lot, but because it's been a while, we have a lot to talk about. I do want to say Bond has been on the road a bit, and he has a personal story from earlier in the week. I've got something that got in my craw, and I have to vent about a little bit. But before I do, I know that these series of books will be very familiar to most people who listen to us, and they were very important to me, and they unlike a lot of people who say the scary stories and the more scary stories to tell in the dark, the Alvin Schwartz collection with the famous Stephen Gamble artwork, a lot of people will say to you that opened them up to reading. I was already a very heavy reader when I discovered those books, but they definitely ignited a love of folklore with myself. Do you have any memories of those books, Brendan?
Yeah, I had, I believe the two books. I remember getting them at a Scholastic book fair. I remember getting at least the first one at a Scholastic book fair at Evans City Elementary School. Anyone who's seen that art, it really pulls you. It either repulses you or it pulls you in. It's like one or the other, And fourth or fifth grade, whatever, Brendan was very much into that. I was just like, oh, this is rad looking. And then you start reading the stories and you're like, oh, it's just gonna be like, yeah, ghost stories, like whatever. Then you start reading the stories and you're like, man, these are intense. And looking back, some of them, like, I'm not sure if they were terribly appropriate for fourth graders with
no, you turned out all right.
Yeah, right. Of course. Yeah. I mean, look at us now. What could have possibly gone different? No, but I absolutely love those books. So yeah, I'm right there with you.
Yeah. I love the illustrations really drew me in initially as well. Some of the stories I think people forget, as you mentioned, some of them were very dramatic. The one that really freaked me out was Harold with the scarecrow, and he's holding a human skin above the milking cabin and whatnot at the end up on the roof. That one freaked me out, but then there were some other ones that were just funny stories. They really were folk tales that Alvin Schwartz had collected either firsthand or through going through books and whatnot. There's a documentary I'd seen, but the reason I bring them up is because, as you're familiar, there was a film adaptation of the books that came out fairly recently, and last night my family and we all watched it together. And I will say this, because I love those books so much, and because I love Alvin Schwartz and Stephen Gamble, I even have a copy of Eliot's Old Possum's Book of Cats, the poems, because Stephen Gamble did the illustrations for that. Because I hold those so highly in my childhood and just kind of shaping me, I was very cautious about watching the movie. I didn't want it to kind of spoil. I will say this, I thought they did a really good job, not only was the recreation of some of the images that you see. Not only was it spot on, not only does it take place in a fictitious town in Pennsylvania that does look a lot like everywhere we live, but it hit a really good place where it was very atmospheric, but it was aimed at younger people. It was aimed at slightly younger teens and whatnot. But I enjoyed it. But I will say that, again, I went in being very apprehensive, because so often when something you hold so closely, when it's defined in ways outside of your imagination, you can be very, very quick to be judgmental. But no, I thought it was really great, and I thought it hit a lot of good notes. I don't know. Have you seen it? Have you thought about seeing it?
Well, I only saw part of it, unfortunately. I really liked the trailer whenever the trailer came out. And anyone who has seen the book, whenever you see some of the depictions of some of the different monsters and everything, they really did an excellent job in that sense. Like they really did. And as someone who is a fan of horror movies like Creepshow, I really like the kind of like the anthology, kind of format in films. And I think in this movie with the, like you said, like the teens, in the town, that was a good vehicle for it. And I thought it actually worked really well. And what was the movie rated? I think it was only PG-13. It wasn't R.
You are correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was only PG-13.
Yeah. So anyone out there who has kids with that are into like horror movies and stuff, this is definitely like you can watch this with like, appropriately aged kids. And I think everybody who is either seen the movies or read the books before or hasn't would still enjoy it. I think it's an enjoyable movie.
It's not gory, but it's far less gory than some of the stories in the collection were.
But some of like the practical effects that they used and everything. Granted, we have to say that like this is all on the heels of Stranger Things. A lot of like the 80s vibe and practical effects and things like that are definitely present. But yeah, 110% worth watching, especially if you've read the books previously. And like you said about going in with a very critical mind, I was just talking to one of my friends the other day about this, how whenever you really care about the source material, of anything, this happens to me a lot with Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, things like that. I really do care about the source material. When things go good or bad, you're more likely to have a more passionate response to it, one way or the other.
Well, I've had a lot of comments that the more into a thing you are, the more kind of selective you become about it by necessity. And obviously I make that illusion with music a lot. People that have extremely strong opinions and negative opinions about music tend to be the people that are very into music. And of course, that's with everything. But you know what? You mentioned some things there about kind of an era that it hits, and it's depicted to be in the late 60s, 1968. But, some of the things you said I hadn't thought of in that sort of production mindset that you have. But it really hit me, like we talked about before, the late 80s, early 90s, made-for-TV movies were really a Stephen King vehicle.
Right.
We've said like a half dozen different ones. And it really, while I was watching it, made me think that. It made me think
it has that vibe.
And yeah.
And it's funny.
Hateful Things was another one, I think.
Right, exactly. And one of the things, this is forgive us listeners if this is too far of a tangent, but it's something I've been thinking about recently, because it is we're getting close to Halloween. When people of our generation, millennials, think about Halloween, we typically think of movies from the 80s. That's like where a lot of the best stuff, we say, kind of comes from. And especially because of Stranger Things and other movies and other cultural, kind of memes like that.
The return right now to the
exactly.
80s,
Yeah,
we
just had Hocus Pocus 2 came out, which is 90s technically, but same kind of vibe. I think it's very similar to how the Boomer generation views Christmas, where it was all basically 50s Christmas. That becomes the Christmas aesthetic as the generations kind of like go along. I think because our generation is so into Halloween that kind of like late 70s into the 80s, kind of into the early 90s, is when we think of Halloween, that's kind of the time period that we harken back to culturally a lot.
I think you have something there, and I come back to something we've talked about a lot before, the Satanic Panic.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of popular media imagery was focused around that. And so,
Right.
yeah, I agree. I've talked to friends of mine that were born in the late 60s, and we talk about that if you were – I don't get into generational things so much just because I think it's mostly just a marketing thing by and large. I don't think there's a lot of real truth to it because I think about the lives my friends born in the early to mid 60s led, and really our childhoods weren't all that different. We didn't have many different experiences, other than just the number of TV stations you may have had. But, I had antennas for a while. But I think you have something like Christmas. Look at Christmas music. We're not the first to kind of point this out, but most of it, immediate post-war years. Most of it.
Most of it.
Some Christmas songs are newer that have come in, but like the canonical ones are predominantly late 40s into the mid 50s. And there's just a smattering thereafter. I never thought of Christmas as being like pocketed within that era. But I think there's something to it, and I wonder why that is. But definitely Halloween, I think the rise of slasher films in the 70s, the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s may have a lot to do with that. But even also just kind of how fashions, especially in the late 80s, kind of were definitely an autumnal thing.
Right, exactly. No, I think you're right. And I just think it's an interesting context to put some of that media in whenever we're kind of analyzing it. I think it's a useful bucket sometimes.
We should think about this more and maybe write these ideas down. But another reason why we haven't been together maybe is because you've been on the road a bit, as we said, and you mentioned, and you didn't say much deliberately to me, but you mentioned you had a personal story. I'm just going to shut up and let you share it. You did say there's a video, but we'll talk about that later.
Right. So this is a good example of Peridolia, and I think that's probably the answer. Without putting the cart before the horse.
Can you give a definition of that there?
So Peridolia, excellent. Thank you. So Peridolia is basically when your brain misinterprets something for something else. It's often wrapped up in the idea of matrixing, which is like, the whole thing of like, oh, when you see a face where there's not a face, human brains are very good at picking things out, and patterns.
Dr. Michael Shermer refers to this as patternicity or pattern-seeking behaviors.
Yes, and Peridolia is basically where you think you're hearing something anomalous that it is in fact not anomalous. And it can be very hard for your brain to, once it's decided what it is, it's very hard to kind of talk yourself out of it. So that's, I think, what happened to me. But I want to get your thoughts on it. So I was up at Oil Creek State Park, which is a beautiful park. I love it up there. I'm up there quite often. Just doing some photos, just hanging out. The water was too low to fish. So I was up there just taking photos, enjoying myself. And as I'm setting up my tripod right next to the creek, setting up my tripod, working on my camera, getting some settings, trying to get some like long exposure, watery, autumnal photos. And I've been there for probably 5 minutes in that same spot, just kind of working with stuff, trying to get stuff right, switching lenses out, yada, yada. And I hear what sounds like something big splashing in the water. And I feel like it's like 50 yards ahead of me and on the other side of the creek. And it's a pretty wide creek. I mean, at its narrowest, the creek is probably 30 yards wide.
Yeah, this would be a river in a lot of places.
Right, exactly. Yeah, if it wasn't so, but it's probably only, again, at this time of year, it's only 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet deep in some places. So it's not like big water. But anyway, so I hear this splashing and I look up and I'm hearing this splashing. It sounds like violent splashing, but I don't see anything. And I'm like, well, maybe it's fish. Because I mean, you've seen fish running in shallow water. A small fish can make a lot of noise.
I remember
like squirrels in the
watching.
woods.
Yeah, we were watching fish like right on the banks. You and I were out in Center County, not far from State College once, and the fish were starting to spawn there. Then, so we were watching trout, which are very territorial, and just maybe 6 inches deep of water, and it's it can cause a lot of water disturbance and noise. Yeah, it's really interesting.
And that's kind of what I thought, because I'm looking and I'm like, I don't see anything. And then what I hear after the splashing has stopped is I hear, as someone who fishes and wades in water quite often, I know what the sound of someone walking through shin deep water sounds like. And I am hearing someone walk through the water 30, 40 yards upstream from me. I'm looking and there's nothing there. I don't see any disturbances in the water outside of like the normal riffles and everything, but I'm hearing this walking. And it's enough that at this point I have stopped playing with my camera and I'm just standing there trying to think, like, what the heck am I hearing? It got to the point where I was like, is something happening? Like, am I having a paranormal experience right now? Because it's still going and I could hear it like physically coming closer, to the point where I get my phone out and I start recording, and I don't even say anything at first on the video. I just kind of let it play. Whenever I have you listen to the video, if you think it's worth, I'll actually drop the video audio in right here. So you may have just heard that the audio right there, but if not, you hear it, or I'm hearing it. Nothing is coming across the water, and then it stops, and all I can hear again are just like the riffles and everything in front of me. I decide, like, okay, I have to have just been mishearing riffles. Like, that's the only non-paranormal explanation. Because I mean, like, the sound does weird things in over water. It can modulate in weird ways. It travels way farther than you'd expect. Wind direction can do a lot of things. Sun hitting water can warm it up quickly and make it react differently to the rocks that are around. There's a lot of natural occurrences. Like, I would have bet a lot of money I heard something splashing in the water and then walking through it towards me 30 yards upstream. And it stopped, and I was like, it was just a very weird experience because it lasted probably 30 seconds, 45 seconds. It wasn't like a quick thing, but it was just very weird.
You could see the water up through that distance. It's not like there was a bend in the stream.
Well, yeah, and there was a bend maybe 50 yards up, and I actually packed my camera up and walked up there to see if there was anybody fishing around like the corner or something, because that would have explained it then.
Right. It just would have sounded like the sound had been directed, so it sounded like it was coming forward to you,
right,
even though it
wasn't. And then I'm sitting there looking at these riffles that it had to have been just making weird noises again. So, like, I think what happened was an example of Peridolia, where my brain had been hearing the riffles the whole time and is taking in that information and filtering it. Then suddenly something was different enough that it made me pay attention. And my brain goes, oh no, that's someone walking through the water. And it's hard to talk yourself out of it, even though you don't see it, kind of thing. So again, not sure if it was a paranormal experience, but it was a weird experience, and one that was weird enough that I pulled my phone out to try and capture it, because I was just like, what in the world is happening?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I don't know how we would compare. The problem with the video may be that there's not enough of the background, just like, you hear the rhythm of a stream, and it's never constant, but it becomes a white noise.
Right, exactly.
So you get a kind of baseline of what things are sounding like. But some of the things I'm wondering about, it's autumn, it's October here in Pennsylvania. That's a region that's already starting to peak as far as the fall foliage is. Were there leaves collecting? Because sometimes we have what we call features in the water, which is when a rock or a piece of wood is jutting out and the water moves around it, and it'll collect a lot of like leaf debris, especially. And
then that can
knock it, and then that.
Right. So it was either a normal experience, and I experienced Peridolia, or it was a paranormal experience. It was just a very weird one that wasn't scary. It was just confusing. So
No, and I'm just looking for like different possibilities,
right.
because it could have been something kicked up, something
Right.
like a log or a rock underwater, and now the background water noise is changing while something's moving.
Right.
Whatnot.
And like there are, I mean, outside the normal animals, there are river otters up there. There are fisher cats. You know, there are
water snakes, and even
there are
though
water
it's kind of
snakes too.
cold,
Yeah.
let me say something real quick. We were leaving to go up to my mom-in-law's. I jumped out of the passenger seat because I saw a snake behind me, and it was big, and it was on the road. My wife thought, that's not a real snake, and I said, look at it. And I chased after the snake, because this is what normal people do.
Well, of course.
It was nearly 4 feet long, and there was a split second. That's a big snake,
That's a good snake.
There was a split second. I noticed the head shape, and I thought, oh, that's not good. And I'm like, well, it's not. We only have 3 poisonous snakes here in Pennsylvania, and only 2 of them are common. That would be the timber rattlesnake, which this I could tell right away was not.
Yeah.
And the copperhead, which I could again tell right away this was not, but it had that V-shaped head, which you usually cautious about.
Yeah.
Our region of Pennsylvania has the Massasauga rattler, which is not common through the rest of Pennsylvania, but it's a little more docile. It's another rattlesnake. There was a split second it looked like a Massasauga, and I'm like, oh boy, I better keep people away. Another guy in the neighborhood came out. He has a couple snakes. This thing wheeled itself into the wheels of a car. I will put the picture. I will send it to you so you can put it up.
Nice. Yeah, please do.
But talking to, I realized it's some sort of like rat snake or something.
Yeah.
And our friend Aaron, who is a game warden, very knowledgeable about snakes, he identified it as, I think he said a gray. Let me see what he said exactly. But the bottom line is it was not poisonous.
Yeah.
The police did show up. It must have been very exciting for them as well. But yes, there are water snakes in that water, because you and I have both been out there.
Oh,
and they will.
Times.
Yeah, and those little things are mean.
Yeah, they're not afraid of you. They are very aware that you were in their territory. Yeah, no,
and even though they're not poisonous, they have an anticoagulant. So when they bite you will bleed. He says it's almost certainly a gray rat snake, and he had one just that one up me. He had seen one yesterday in his yard, so he took a picture of it, but it wasn't nearly as big as the one I saw around the corner from my house.
Right. But yeah, so again, I don't know exactly what happened, but it was just a weird experience. And again, the fact that it's fall, we're getting close to Halloween. Even knowing all those things, I'm still sitting there and I'm like, man, I am so sure of what I am hearing. And it reminded me of just some of the stories that we hear about people hearing stuff in the woods, being very sure of what they're hearing, and it was a very similar experience where it wasn't creepy at all. It was just very kind of confusing. Now, this would have been nighttime or anything like that, or if there would have been anything else creepy going on, I would have not stuck around to take a video. I would have just left. I would have been like, because again, I'm not brave like that. So.
Well, I have to ask you, how close were you to one of the ghost towns? Because there are quite a number of ghost towns.
only about half a mile from the Blood Farm. Yeah, so not too far. Yeah.
Which again, Blood Farm.
Right. Yeah. So, but anyway, so yes, that's kind of my little recent story. But you said you have something you were excited to talk to about tonight. So I'm looking forward to this.
Well, I got annoyed. It doesn't happen very often.
Got a bee in your bonnet.
So as they say, I picked up a book. My library is undergoing renovation, so I got to choose wisely because I don't want to do the curb service thing while they're getting new carpeting installed. I got a book about these disappearances, Vanished or something like that. I'm not going to say the name or the author because I got annoyed pretty early into it. There's a great story about a riverboat, 5 big boilers to power the power wheel in the late post-Civil War, but before the turn of the century. It's coming from New Orleans on its way to Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
It's up the Mississippi, and it disappears without a trace.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the 5 of the barges that are behind it being towed by this riverboat were found cut loose and everything. And I'm listening to this story, and I'm like, no. I've heard of this riverboat before. So I look it up. And the Iron Mountain Riverboat, okay, very quickly, was a stern wheel riverboat that was built 1870s, and it was built at Pittsburgh. Okay. Yeah. So it was built on the Ohio River, and basically it ran aground and sank about 10 years after it had been built. However, for whatever reason, a lot of people claim that it just vanished. It did not vanish. One person did die when it ran aground, but no, it didn't vanish, and not all the lives were lost. And it's very easy to demonstrate. No, we know exactly where it sank. We have eyewitness testimonials of it running aground. I have no idea how this story began, but apparently it is a not uncommon legend to talk about this ship that did in no way disappear. So much so that so many people who report the legend, because I started digging deeper into it a little bit.
So real quick,
they claim it sunk the same year it was built.
Yeah. So where are people like reporting seeing this boat? And this isn't the Arabia, is it? This is a different.
No. This is a boat called the Iron Mountain.
Okay, so it's called the Iron Mountain. Okay, I missed that. I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So just a real quick, the legend is that it was leaving New Orleans to Pittsburgh. It was loaded down with cotton or sugar or a mix thereof.
Yeah.
And it was outside of Vicksburg on the Mississippi, and it was going north, and it had a bunch of barges and a number of crew and passengers. It had been seen, and then it disappeared. I believe, from what I saw, there was a book called Strangest of All that was first published in the 1950s that claimed, but the story had been going around for some time before then. However, the actual boat was sailing from Vicksburg, okay, and it hit an embankment or something at a place called Stumpy Point, tore a hole in the hull of the ship, and it sank. So the crew, they ran onto the barges that it was carrying, but there was a woman below deck who was caught there, and she died when it ran aground and sank.
Oh, okay. So it was a fatality. Okay.
Yeah, but her body was picked up a day or two later, and no one else of the ship. Wreckage of the ship was found, in the days following as well, because the parts of the ship were carried away. And you can confirm this by looking at contemporary newspapers of the day. So it's very clear that this paddle boat, those big wheeled paddle boat sort of things, no, it definitely did not disappear. Yeah. So it kind of got me irritated. And this is a very roundabout way to ask you, Ed and Lorraine Warren, what do you know about them?
Oh, gosh.
I don't know what your opinion is, because
I wasn't sure how many episodes we would make it until we had this conversation.
Just your initial impression, because you can see this is a very roundabout, but somehow when I was doing the research, I just put this book down. I'm like, I don't even want to continue with this book, because now everything in it's questionable, and I don't have the time to research every single claim of disappearance it makes here. And somehow it got me thinking about, boy, the Warrens really irritated me.
Right.
Well, what are your feelings?
So it's one of those things where whenever I was younger, I watched shows like Paranormal State, Ghost Hunters, and other TV shows like that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed a lot of those. Anyone else who's watched a lot of those shows is going to be familiar with the Warrens. Anybody who has seen The Conjuring is going to be familiar with the Warrens. And there's so much mixed information out there. You know, you talk to some people and they say they were complete charlatans. You talk to other people and you say they were, you know, the best folks around, kind of thing. For me, it seems like there was a lot of, trying to think how to say this properly, because I don't want to shit talk. If they were as legit as a lot of people say they were very conveniently placed to a lot of very extraordinary events. That's how I'm going to say
I think I see what you're saying. It's almost like there was a joke around the Pittsburgh media market. There was always this reporter who seems to be first on the scene at murders. And the joke was that he was killing people so he could get the scoop because he just always seemed to be there. I'm sure, like,
if that was a movie, like a comedy with Leslie Nielsen in it, I'd watch it. That's funny. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that.
But that was obviously no one really believed it, but it was just kind of a funny thing. Like, how is he there so quickly? Like, the police haven't even arrived yet, and he's gonna. There's a murder in progress.
That's basically what it is. Like, for how rare legitimate legitimate hauntings, like especially intelligent hauntings, are, for how very few, and again, this is my own personal opinion, for how very few actual like demonic things are out there. Boy, they ran into them a lot. I think like that's kind of like the Occam's razor for me, where it's like, what's more likely that stuff was either, you know, exaggerated or fabricated, or put into a bucket that it didn't need to be put into, or were they just running into every demon in the country, you know, kind of thing.
They definitely strike me as the sort of people that would hear or be told that something's haunted or be requested, and then they would validate that. We should point out that it has been said before that they never made money. They never asked for money from the people. But, however, you mentioned not only how frequently they seem to encounter some remarkable things, but they have been at the center of different book and movie deals. You mentioned The Conjuring, which I've never seen. I don't think I have any desire to. But the big hit for a lot of people would be the Amityville story. Right. And, of course, the story of a haunting in Connecticut. But the Amityville, right. And, of course, the doll Annabelle, which other people... Now, we've talked about a different haunted doll on Ghost Furnace before.
Robert, if you're out there, I'm sorry. We've talked about you. Again, I don't believe it, but I don't want to attempt it.
No reason to make enemies now.
Right, exactly. No, but you're right. No, I mean, Amityville is one of the probably the most popular and the one that has the most misinformation out there, from what I understand.
I agree, and I feel really weird about it. So I went on this whole thing where I just started doing more and more looking into it and like, what was their deal? They both had like very long life, and that's good. I'm happy for them. But they really struck me as charlatans, as bad as people like Sylvia Brown, who were constantly on television talk shows when I was in my teenage years. Now, I remember watching about the Amityville thing on In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, which also the soundtrack for that show deeply impacted me. But so very quick rundown how they got into it is Ed claimed to have grown up in a haunted house. Lorraine claimed to be some sort of medium. They were interested in art. They would do paintings of supposedly haunted houses and asked if they could hear the stories and investigate the house.
Which is a cool origin story, by the way. Like, I'll give them that. That's pretty cool. Like, I mean, if I met those folks, I want to hang out with them. Yeah, exactly.
If that's where things had been and it left at that, that would have been all right. But it becomes so much more. And Amityville's only the most. That was like their big press thing. their media blitz debut, I would say, because of course there were the books and then the movies that came out, and they were involved in a lot of that, and they made some bank on that. And I remember some time ago, and I struggled to find it for tonight because I had hoped to have the audio where they were confronted by people, that the Warrens themselves were confronted on the news by people who were living in the house after the infamous Lutz family, and they claimed, well, there's nothing here. And you're making the collateral damage is the people who have lived in that house ever since have had to deal with a series of gawkers. And there's a certain level which that's respectable, but there's also like people trying to get in the house. I saw a report from the news from the 80s where people were driving up. It was 1979 or 80. People were driving up. They were saying, oh my God, I didn't realize people lived there. I thought it had been left vacant. They've changed the house number. They changed the famous windows in the attic. And yet the news kept saying, well, they changed the house number to 108 and everything. Well, good job, news.
Yeah, it doesn't help.
No, feel bad for a lot of people or collateral damage. So I went through this whole thing going through the Amityville stuff, and not only was so much of it over the top, not only was there a lawyer who claimed to have been involved in part of the writing and had approached the family about writing a book about the murders. There's just so much. The young man, now an older man, who the original, the family, the DeFeo family that was murdered in the home before the Lutzes moved in, he's claimed all sorts of different things over the years, but he doesn't claim to have been possessed. He claims he was crazy. He claims the mob or the government killed his family. He claims his one sister killed the family and then he killed her. He says a lot of different things, but I had seen an entire episode where there was a very interesting Dr. Hans Holzer being interviewed about this. Now, he stated quite a few things, but he says that the Warrens were totally out to lunch. This Dr. Hans Holzer at some point seems completely reasonable because he says that, no, these things are not, this is just too over the top. There's just too much going on to be believable. The lawyer said he agreed. He said a lot of the imagery was created through conversations, and this Hans Holzer then goes on to say that, well, there had been a previous house on the site, and it was on an Indian burial ground, and there is a chief who is very upset. And
you guys can't see me rolling my eyes, but
I know so it's like, boy, he was so good for a while, but again, his claims are so much smaller, so much more innocuous. He's not claiming that these spirits are making anybody kill anybody or are manifesting themselves.
Right.
So I was like, oh, I would rather have that guy. But there's so many instances where it seems like I don't know who's not being taken advantage of, because the other big thing, and it was a movie which I really liked, which was that Haunting in Connecticut movie. I really liked it.
It was a fun movie, yeah.
No, but the imagery was great. Another story that claims to be based on a true story. And of course, the Warrens were at the heart of that one too. The person that authored the book with the Warrens and the family, though, talked a lot about, like, these people couldn't keep their story straight. They were going through a lot of trouble. There were drugs involved. All their stories were contradicting one another.
Right.
And it seems to me that you have a family that was going through a lot of turmoil, and did they benefit from maybe making money from this story being told, or were they also being exploited by these people that, frankly, I'll come out and say, I feel are charlatans?
One of the things that I feel like, and I know we've talked about this before, but I think it bears further investigation, is a lot of times when you talk about these, especially these big stories, like the ones that have a lot of attention and history, they do get very complicated because there's so much going on. And I think kind of sad for me, because there's always like this awful trauma that has been, that usually seems like it is used as a excuse for paranormal activity, not a problem in itself that needs addressed. And one of the things you also have is, you have mental health and emotional health. When people say like, oh, well, why would someone make up a story? There's no money in it. Well, one, in cases like this, there is. Two, I don't think people give enough credit to how, if you have someone who's really sad, really feels alone in the world, how much a little attention is worth to some people.
Yeah.
And even if it's just someone talking to someone else on a podcast, to being able to fantasize about being heard, to be able to just for a few minutes be the person in charge telling the story, like all your favorite authors, and it creates,
I get what you're saying, and
you know where I'm going, where it's like,
well, and I'll say
that.
this.
Yeah.
I'll say this is a very real and very common thing I talk about in my line of work with young people that have been abused and been neglected and been in extreme cases, and any attention is positive. It's like no bad press. And so a lot of times we will see youth acting out, and because negative attention is still attention from another person.
For exactly, yeah. Especially when you're starved for validation and things like that. I think in a lot of cases you have, whether or not there's real paranormal activity going on, you have that's almost secondary to the fact that you have these really complex situations that involve typically lots of negativity and trauma, and then you have people that come in this case, the Warrens, but in other cases it's other ghost hunters or sometimes psychics, like you said before, or just mystics in general, claiming to have an answer, and suddenly you have someone trying to help you.
Yeah, and maybe those initial people were blaming these different things before, but it's ignoring other there was
problems.
another
Yeah.
Exactly. There was another family that a case not as well known that the Warrens were involved in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, where the family had requested the Catholic Church do an exorcism and all this stuff, and the church went there and they said there's no need for this, and a priest even had stayed in the house and said there was nothing weird. There was this is a duplex, and the neighbor next door said there's nothing weird in this building. But the Warren said, oh no, there's a demon in this building, and the only reason anybody can live there now is because we exorcised it. But the family continued to live there, but they kept claiming things. And so the Warren said, well, when we kept coming to exorcise it, the demon would run next door into the other duplex where that guy was saying there wasn't anything happening. Well, so what is it? But at the same time, I know, right? But at the same time, the haunting in Connecticut story, there was what not a lot of people know. There was a person living in an apartment upstairs in that building, and they claimed that there was nothing weird about the place. But the Warrens at that time claimed, well, no, because it's centered here. Well, maybe if you try to exercise it, the rats would scurry into the other apartment. I don't know what to think. This comes to another thing, but I don't want to leave your point entirely. It's that the Warrens claim to be looking through these things in a scientific way. We've talked about
the guys
before
of science,
with a lot of these ghost hunting things, but the difference is this with the Warrens spectacularly is that they claim to have a robust amount of evidence. They claim to have some sort of cash thing on the table for anybody that could disprove what they were doing, but at the same time, they would hoard. They've been accused of hoarding all of the supposed scientific evidence they had, and also claiming that, well, they can't be disproven because you can't disprove a spiritual thing with science, which is just moving the goalposts around, is the common phrase.
Right.
And so that bothers me in the way that a lot of these other ghost groups with all their different supposed scientific devices doesn't if they're willing to put their findings, their recordings, their photos up to scrutiny of different things.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ghost hunting groups out there who do have folks in it that are trying to do good, like they're doing work in good faith, and they are, again, I don't necessarily agree with what they're trying to do all the time, but they are trying to use some sort of a method to slowly gather a body of information that they can, and usually they're very willing to share that information. And I think there is something to the fact that, like, okay, like if you have a group that always goes in this area and they always get high EMF readings, that doesn't necessarily mean it's haunted, but it does mean that that area probably does have high EMF, which means a whole bunch of other things. Anytime someone is hoarding information, especially when it's in a already questionable kind of like realm, like that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the cause, kind of thing. Especially if you're someone who is very wrapped up in the idea that we need to prove the existence of the other to whoever.
So I only have two more things to kind of say. One's going back to your point, and it's a pattern that you see, especially with the Warrens, but it's not exclusive to them, is that there are people who are in difficult circumstances for a variety of reasons. It's definitely true in the Connecticut story. It's definitely true in the Luzerne County story with that family. There were some medical things involved, and I don't know if it's necessarily true about the Lutz family in the Amityville story. I assume that it is to some degree. One of the worst books I've ever read.
Which is saying so. That's a heck of a statement, because me and you have read some bad books.
A few books. I've read some terrible things all the way, but our friend Brian, who of course we've had on here quite a few times, I think he will agree with me, because I shared it with him and I said, look, you can keep this thing, just get rid of it for me. We read this book. A local politician had written it about a house he loved, and as an adult he got to move into the house, but he claimed the house was haunted, and he wrote a whole story about it. I'm not going to say what the book is.
Does it start with a B?
It sure does.
Okay, I didn't realize you read that book too. Okay, cool.
Yeah, anyway, Brian and I agreed that basically he had a family, he had a wife, and he had a couple kids, and we actually played music with one of the kids in parallel bands, but basically they had a lot of typical teenage behaviors, and he blamed it all on demons and ghosts because it couldn't possibly. And so anything negative that would happen to the family anyway whatsoever, he blamed on ghosts. And of course, former residents and neighbors all said, there's nothing to this. They just had a normal life with the tribulations of normal lives, but no problem. It's just a extreme lack of self-reflection, awareness of normal behaviors in people. And it really put me off. And I wonder, when you were talking about the people and the attention, it also makes me wonder, there's that sad aspect, but then there's this pathetic lack of just kind of self-awareness.
In some cases, that's a part of it too. Yeah.
So in that situation, like if the Warrens had gone to that person, I'm sure they would have agreed with them, because again, they strike me as the sort of people that have never walked into a situation where they couldn't find something supernatural, where no supernatural explanation was necessary, let alone reasonable. So, but the final thing, and this is becoming more spoken about, and I'm not the first to bring it up. I don't know if you're aware of it, though. There is a woman, now in her 70s, states that she lived with the family for more than 40 years and that she was in a romantic relationship with Ed Warren starting when she was 15 and in high school, and he was her bus driver. This is a claim. I'm not saying this is a definitive thing, but apparently there are some legal things happening about this involving the estate.
I have not heard about that at all.
There's a woman, her name, this is public knowledge, her name is Judith Penny, who has made these claims. She said she moved in with the family when she was 15. She claimed, too, that she was involved in creating some hoaxes. They were romantically involved in some way. The Warrens do not deny that she lived with them, but claimed that they took her into their house when she was 18 because she had nowhere else to go. However, from what I was reading in different news things, a neighbor at one point had reported to the police because of concerns. Why is this teenage girl in there? It's very weird. It's not a pretty thing. I don't know if it's true. It is an allegation. There's legal things being explored.
Well,
but it doesn't. Yeah.
When did Lorraine pass away? A few years ago,
I believe.
Because Ed's been dead since the mid 2000s.
I think he died in 2006.
Something like
that. I can confirm that real quick. That
sounds about right. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, Ed died in 2006. Lorraine died in 2019, so very recently.
Oh, Anne Rose was that recent? Okay, but
yeah.
Ew.
This is a new thing, though. So
yeah, as I say, I haven't heard that at all, and I'm surprised I haven't heard that on any other shows.
This woman came forward with her claims, I believe, again, from what I was reading from the notes I have, in 2017. Again,
okay, so pretty recent, yeah.
This is not confirmed. We do know that she lived with them. She claims she was groomed by Ed at the age of 15. So it's just... I didn't like them before, though. I don't need to go on speculation because I feel grounded enough in saying that a lot of the things that they claim to be real are bogus. A lot of the people who have been to their occult museum state that, I mean, essentially, I found a wonderful statement about something that, their occult museum is filled with just kind of off-the-rack Halloween items. And here's a quote from somebody. The Warrens, I'm going to quote something. I don't have the exact source, but these are not my words. The Warrens themselves claim they once encountered a werewolf demon. Okay?
Okay.
And they have an entire book about this case, in which they specifically said that they have exhaustive documentation, but they never shared any of it, right? They also, in their, I'm trying to find the exact thing, but they also had a coffin from a modern vampire, okay, who they had met with.
Okay.
They present the coffin as evidence, but not the vampire.
Well, there are... Oh, gosh.
I mean...
it's just like there's so much.
Right. Yeah. There's so much. So it's just that... Again, I know I'm more skeptical. I know Mike, when he started this whole Ghost Furnace thing, asked me to come on specifically because I'm the Doubting Thomas, but I really would like to see a full reevaluation of the Warrens. I don't know. I know it's already started with a lot of people, but I don't know how it seems so many people were willing to be incredulous about these people through the 70s, 80s, and really until very recently, as The Conjuring says. And I think at the end of the day, it's just the exploitive element that we know these people are nonsense, but they're making us money. They've made a lot of money for a lot of film people. And the Warrens, maybe in the crassest, most callous way, looked at these people and said, we know this isn't real, but we're making money. I don't know. Maybe that's me just being too negative, but I don't think so. I think I'm being very realistic here.
Yeah, it's tough because I mean, I don't know. For every one person that surprises you, there's someone else to disappoint you. Anytime you have I don't want to say genre, but like an area of the world that is rooted, because I mean, anything paranormal for the most part starts with death in a lot of ways, which is a complicated thing, both culturally, spiritually, personally, physically. I think that anytime you have something that is rooted in something that tumultuous, that runs the gamut from tragic to beautiful, you're going to have some really complicated people showing up along the way.
I agree. But I see the Warrens, though. I think you said a very beautiful thing there, but I see the Warrens story, to me, it's not being so complicated, so much as is they represent to me just kind of a shameful trespass on some basic decency.